Hello. In this video, I thought I would try to give you a kind of visual representation of where we've been and where we're going in this particular course. So here goes. Of course, the whole point of the course is to get a good understanding of moral theory. And of course, that means trying to decide what moral theory is, what morality itself is like. And that's what a moral theory is. It's a theory about what morality is. Okay, and so of course we've got lots of promising answers, and some of the answers that immediately occur to people are among those answers that aren't very promising at all. So one of the first things that often occurs to people is that morality is a kind of sort of individual thing, that it is, in other words, subjective. Okay. Now, of course, this sort of a view makes people morally infallible by definition, generates all kinds of contradictions, and so ultimately we're not really going to go there. Now there are some other varieties, right, that have a kind of subjective flavor to them, ways of arguing that morality really doesn't exist at all, right? And these are prescriptivist or emotivist views, or some other views like them. These views we haven't mentioned in the course because they're very sophisticated views about the meanings of moral terms that require a lot of technicality. You might at some point see these views in an advanced undergraduate course, perhaps more likely in a graduate course on ethical theory, not so much here. So for our purposes, each of these views has some really terrible flaws, and subjectivism as a basic view, normative subjectivism, this is just not going to fly. So that at least gets blocked off. Also, it may occur to people that say, well, look, it seems like culture or, time and place have a variety of things to do with morality. Well, descriptively they do, but normatively maybe not so much. And so another family of views about ethics are relativist views, the most common, of course, of which is cultural relativism, which says that whatever is moral is whatever your culture says it is. But of course, you could also have other kinds of relativism, like temporal relativism, as whatever people in your time think is moral is what is moral or not, or whatever people who live near you say. This would be a kind of geographic relativism. And of course, all of these things have the same problem. If it's a problem for individuals to be, by definition, morally infallible, then it seems that much more problematic to make groups of people, by definition, morally infallible. And of course, there's a lot of counterintuitive implications of these kinds of ideas if we take them seriously. So we decide that the best thing to do is simply not take them seriously. So subjectivism is out, relativism is out. Okay, these are both topics in the second week of the course. Continuing on, if we have eliminated subjectivist and relativist ideas from our consideration, what we're left with are only objective views about morality. That means that that there's a fact of the matter, right? Things are either right or they're wrong, and it doesn't matter what people think about whether they're right or wrong, and it doesn't matter how people feel about whether those things are right or wrong. They're going to be right or wrong for some kind of reasons, independent of people's feelings or views or opinions. And so, of course, that doesn't narrow things down a lot. There's a lot of ways in which moral theory can be objective. And so one way a moral theory can be objective is being a kind of appeal to authority. Right? The most common appeal to authority in ethics that we see is a kind of appeal to religion or God. Right? This is known as the divine command theory, the idea that what is moral or isn't is so or isn't so because God says so. Right? Now, in general, if we're having some form of an argument or a dispute, and if I decide to say, well, look, my cousin Biff says X, and that means that that's the end of the discussion, right? Whatever Biff says goes. I suspect you wouldn't be terribly impressed by this tactic, right? That you would think, well, why should I care what Biff says, and why should whatever Biff says hold? Well, you're essentially right that an appeal to authority is just not a very good argument. It's not really an argument at all. And so anything of the same form as, well, because my cousin Biff says so, and you want to say, why should we believe cousin Biff? And notice saying, because my cousin Biff says so is not very, very convincing. And so whether you want to say, why should, morality be this way as opposed to another way, because God says so, because the king says so, because some philosopher said so, because some book says so, or because the majority says so. These are all just varieties of because my cousin Biff says so. And so as a result, all of these forms of appeal to authority are essentially vulnerable to the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma is decisive here. So whatever your source of authority is, either stuff is moral because the authority says so, and for no other reason, in which case morality is just arbitrary. That is, there is no real morality. Or else, the authority says so because of reasons of one kind or another. There are reasons why the authority makes the claims they make about morality. And if that's the case, then it's the reasons that are really important here, not the authority. That is, morality that is independent of the authority. So because the Euthyphro dilemma is decisive with all such kinds of appeals, we're going to go ahead and bar off any idea of authority. Right? Such things are at least objective, but that doesn't mean they're good candidates for a good moral theory. So that's essentially the main thrust of the third week of the course. So from here on, we're going to we're going to move on and start to entertain some much better ideas than some of the ideas we've seen so far. The reason why we take a look at these ideas only to close them off is because they're such common ideas. I trust you found it to be difficult in some cases to try and say, gosh, people really do say that, but it doesn't really work. Or maybe I used to think that, but it doesn't really work, because of course these things don't really work. So if we're going to have an objective sort of morality moving forward, there's a couple of possibilities in terms of discussing morality objectively. One thing we can do is we can try and answer the question, what to do, right? That is, we can think of ethics as about trying to tell us what the right thing to do is or isn't, right? Another way to think about morality objectively is to think of the main question as being, how should one be, right? What sort of personal character should one have? Now, these are related questions, of course, but they're not the same question. And deciding that the main question of morality is either the first one or the second one is going to really make a big difference on what ethical theory looks like. Believe it or not, the oldest way, the most ancient way of answering the question about morality is the question about how to be. And the question about how to be leads us to look at a variety of theories in ethics that are known as virtue ethics theories. Right. Again, these are the most ancient of theories about ethics. There are some to be found among, for example, the teachings of Confucius. Confucius has a system of virtue ethics. Aristotle has a system of virtue ethics that's the first in the Western world. And of course, there are modern systems of virtue ethics that have, taken some of these elements and moved them on. So there's lots of different kinds of virtue ethics. In a 16-week course, we do spend some time discussing virtue ethics and some of its important differences, and some of its upsides, some of its downsides, some of its challenges. But in an 8-week course, we've omitted virtue ethics because we otherwise want to keep the schedule of everything more or less sane. You can't do too many different things in a shortened course. Like, again, even though it's supposed to take you twice as much time, there's just a limit to how many different concepts a person could absorb in one day. So we've had to very sadly prune a little bit of that, but just know that it's there, it does exist. So primarily we're going to be taking a look at the way that modern ethics has tended to go, which is the question about what to do. Right? And among that question, there are a couple of different categories. There are a couple of different areas that we're going to examine. We're going to examine consequentialist ideas about morality, and we're going to examine non-consequentialist ideas about morality. Right? That's the first major branch that we're going to be taking a look at. Consequentialist theories of morality are theories of morality that say that what makes something right or wrong is what happens when you do it. Okay. Notice this is an objective theory of ethics because the things that happen in the actual real world are real actual things that are independent of people's feelings, desires, etc. Right? And beliefs. So among the consequentialist theories of ethics, we're going to be taking a look at one starting this week here. That's probably the most famous of all consequentialist theories of ethics, and that is utilitarianism. But I'll mention here that utilitarianism is not the only kind of consequentialist moral view. Again, in some longer courses, sometimes people will talk about the theory of egoism, which is a form of consequentialism. Now, of course, egoism has a lot of problems. There's some really good arguments against egoism, primarily that it doesn't allow this notion of other regarding duties, right? Whereas it seems like every other moral theory at least has to do that to be somewhat plausible. So again, egoism tends to be one of these non-starters, but other kinds of consequentialist moral theories are out there. We're going to be spending a couple of weeks really talking about utilitarianism because it's one of the big, major, important theories of ethics that there are. It's really stood the test of time well. That doesn't mean it doesn't have certain challenges, it doesn't have certain problems and certain quirks, but it is fundamentally a sensible moral theory. And we're going to take a look at what it is and how it works starting from this week and moving into next. It's also worth mentioning here that there are sub-varieties of utilitarianism as well. For example, qualitative utilitarianism, quantitative utilitarianism, act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism. There are, varieties upon sub-varieties upon sub-varieties. And again, most of those sub-varieties are really only important once you start to dive in at something like a graduate studies level. But that's why we're leaving aside some of that. We're just going to take a look at the basic idea about utilitarianism for this case. So utilitarianism is going to be our main example of what a consequentialist moral theory looks like. But again, it's worth noting that just as there are different varieties of consequentialism, there are other kinds of consequentialist moral theories as well. And it's not that they're necessarily bad. They're just not as well represented in the literature as utilitarianism is. So in terms of non-consequentialist moral theories, that's what we'll take a look at once we are done talking about utilitarianism. Among non-consequentialist moral views, there are a couple of different main sub-varieties. We'll be talking about the difference between monist non-consequentialist views and pluralist non-consequentialist views. Now, of course, there are monist and pluralist versions of consequentialist views as well. There's a way to be a pluralist consequentialist, and there are ways of being monist consequentialists. And so as far as that goes, I'll just point out here that utilitarianism and even egoism are monist consequentialist theories, but really the distinction between monism and pluralism is going to be most important when we're in non-consequentialist moral theories. Non-consequentialist moral theories are moral theories that say that what is important, what makes an action right or wrong, is not anything that happens when you do it. It's something about the action itself. Right? And there are lots of different ways of people have tried to sort of explain that. The most famous non-consequentialist moral theory is what we call Kantian moral theory, because it is based on the writing of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. There are, again, other varieties of monist non-consequentialist moral theory, but Kant's theory is a major one. It's a very famous one, and it's one that we'll spend really kind of a couple of weeks taking a close look at. Among pluralist non-consequentialist views, there are, again, many. Some of the ones we'll sort of take a look at are primarily the view of a fellow by the name of W.D. Ross, right, who provides really the most famous version of pluralist non-consequentialism. So Ross's theory is different from utilitarianism in that Ross is a non-consequentialist, and it's different from Kant's moral theory in that he is a pluralist rather than a monist, right? So those are going to be some of the things that will set those theories apart. You'll notice I haven't really said what makes something monist versus pluralist. That will come later in the course once we start getting that far in. There's also another kind of pluralist view that bears at least a name on the chart, that is particularism. We won't really be talking a great deal about particularism, although Schaefer-Landau will address it in the text. It's ultimately, I think, not a terribly promising version of morality, but it's there, and I've put it in its proper place. Right. Now, of course, you can continue to go on and on and on, and making various distinctions and varieties and sub-varieties of all of these moral theories. And I think that any 10 philosophers who drew this map might get very subtle differences, but the basics are the basics. Right, and this is kind of how the roadmap works. This is the way that we're going to be talking about these kinds of issues, and it's a sort of visual representation of the way different kind of ideas lead us in different directions. And some of those directions we end up closing off because of good reasons, right? We have good arguments for doing so. Other things we leave open, right? Because we don't necessarily have any reason to close them off. And of course, some of these stops are going to be much more mainstream than others. Utilitarian moral theory, Kantian moral theory, and Ross's moral theory, as well as virtue ethics, are all very, very mainstream, right? These are all the kinds of things that lots of ethicists over a long period of time have devoted a lot of mental energy to exploring and becoming clearer about. All right, so I hope that helped. Again, if you have any questions about how things fit into here or about this map at all, I encourage you to post those questions in the content questions section of the forum.